Let me paint you a picture of what law and order looks like under Trump when you take the campaign slogan off the hat and follow it into an actual federal courtroom. It looks like a federal judge asking a government lawyer over and over why court orders keep getting violated, why people are still being held when the judge said they shouldn't be held, why basic due process keeps getting treated like optional paperwork in the government's representative instead of calmly explaining a lawful process, basically blurting out, this job sucks, the system sucks, and I'm so exhausted, I want to be thrown in jail for 24 hours just to sleep. That's not a late-night comedy sketch. That's the United States government in a United States courtroom in Minneapolis in 2026. And if that doesn't tell you something is fundamentally broken, then we've officially replaced citizenship with fandom. The detail that matters here isn't the theatrical line itself, as shocking as it is. The detail that matters is what that line reveals. The Trump immigration enforcement machine is chewing through legal limits so aggressively that the federal courts are now functioning like the emergency room for constitutional injuries. And the people tasked with defending the administration's actions in court are showing up overwhelmed, underguided, understaffed, and increasingly unable to hide what's happening. Because here's the part Trump hates. Federal judges don't care about your slogans. Judges care about compliance. Judges care about orders. Judges care about whether the executive branch thinks it can treat the judiciary like a suggestion. And right now, the judiciary in Minnesota is essentially saying, enough. In the account we're dealing with, the pressure is coming from two places at once. On the ground, you have a huge wave of detentions that are generating a flood of habeas corpus petitions, people asking federal judges to step in because they're being held without due process or without timely legal review. In the courts, you have judges confronting the government because orders are being violated again and again. And looming over all of it is a blunt institutional message. ICE is not a law unto itself. That phrase matters because that's the entire constitutional design in one sentence. No agency is a law unto itself. Not ICE, not DHS, not DOJ, not the White House. Agencies can challenge orders, they can appeal orders, they can ask higher courts to change orders, but they cannot simply ignore orders. Ignoring orders is what you do when you're trying to train the country to accept the idea that power doesn't answer to law. And that is exactly the Trump project, dressed up as enforcement. Now, the account centers on a confrontation in court involving a lawyer named Julie Lee, described as a DOJ lawyer in Minneapolis, someone who previously worked as an attorney connected to ICE in immigration court and then came to help the depleted U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota. What makes this moment so devastating is that it's not a politician talking, it's not an activist yelling, it's a government lawyer admitting in open court that there is no guidance, no direction, no manpower, and that she can't get her client, the federal enforcement apparatus, to follow court orders. Read that again slowly. A government lawyer is telling a federal judge that the government is not reliably complying with the court. That's not a staffing problem. That's a constitutional emergency. Because when the executive branch decides court orders are optional, what you have is not law and order. What you have is power with a uniform and no leash. And you can hear the judge's frustration in the response described. The judge essentially fires back that this crisis is of the government's own making because of non-compliance. That's the dynamic. The court is not asking for feelings. The court is asking for compliance, and the government's representative is offering exhaustion as an explanation. Here's where Trump's defenders will try to play a cheap trick. They'll say, oh, you're just attacking a stressed-out lawyer. You're mocking a woman for being overwhelmed. No, stop it. That's not what this is. The point isn't to mock the person under pressure. The point is to recognize what her breakdown signifies. A system collapsing under the weight of its own lawlessness. When a lawyer in court is effectively saying, I cannot get the federal enforcement machine to follow your orders, that's not a personal failure. That's a structural failure. It's the sound of an agency environment where the rule of law is being treated like an inconvenience. And notice the other institutional detail described. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota is depicted as depleted, only a handful of people left, leadership gone, morale in free fall. That is not normal. That is not how a functioning Justice Department operates. That's what happens when you turn a federal office into a political instrument and good people decide they won't be used. There's even an ugly anecdote described about a Border Patrol figure, Greg Bovino, mocking the religion of a replacement U.S. attorney who is Orthodox Jewish and complaining about Sabbath availability, an anecdote that, whether or not you know every surrounding detail, illustrates the same rotten culture, contempt, politicization, and a workplace environment where professionalism is a joke and basic respect is treated as weakness. This is what happens when Trumpism takes over an institution. It doesn't just change policy, it changes behavior. It changes what people think they can say out loud. It changes the moral temperature. Now step back and look at the headline number that's supposed to make every American sit upright. In January 2026 alone, Minnesota federal courts reportedly dealt with a staggering volume of orders across dozens of cases, and the chief judge is described as saying the number is likely underreported. The chief judge's message, as quoted in this account, is that ICE has violated more court orders in a single month than some agencies violate in their entire existence. If you're a country that cares about separation of powers, that should hit you like a siren. Because the separation of powers isn't a vibe, it's a safeguard. The courts are not advisory. They are not a customer service desk for the executive branch. They are a co-equal branch of government. When the executive branch starts acting like court orders are optional, the entire constitutional system starts to tilt. And when the chief judge follows that with a warning explicitly raising the prospect of contempt proceedings and show cause orders that could require top ICE leadership to appear personally, this is not judicial drama. This is the judiciary using the tools it has left to enforce compliance from an executive branch that is acting like it's above the law. That's why the name Todd Lyons matters in this account. The head of ICE is singled out as someone who could be required to appear if noncompliance continues. That is the court doing what it must do when an agency refuses to act like a lawful agency. And here is why Trump should be sweating. Contempt is one of the few language games the judiciary doesn't play. Contempt is where the court stops asking politely. Contempt is where the court says, you can posture on television all you want, but in this courtroom, you follow the order. Trump's whole political identity is built on the opposite idea, that he can pressure institutions into submission by flooding the zone with noise, threats, and loyalists. But a federal judge is not a cable news segment. A federal judge is not impressed by your rage posts. A federal judge is not afraid of your base. A federal judge has one job: defend the integrity of the court. So what you are watching in this story is the collision between Trump's strongman fantasy and the judiciary's last line of defense. Now, let's address the moral center of this, because it's not court procedure. It's human beings. Habeas corpus exists because governments historically love to lock people up and then get around to the justification later. Habeas corpus is the mechanism that says, no, you don't get to do that. You don't get to hold someone without meaningful process. You don't get to keep someone in a cage while you figure out what story you want to tell the judge. In the account, the courts are being flooded with habeas petitions because people are languishing without due process in detention centers. Whether you are liberal or conservative, whether you think immigration policy should be stricter or looser, you do not get to shrug at that. Due process is not a partisan prize. It is a constitutional requirement. And if the Trump administration is running operations so recklessly that the court system in one state is overwhelmed, the U.S. Attorney's Office is depleted, and judges are issuing extraordinary warnings about noncompliance, then the real story is not enforcement is tough. The real story is this administration is testing how far it can go before the courts force it to stop. That's what authoritarians do. They push until they hit resistance, and if they don't hit resistance, they push further. Now, there's also a darker claim embedded in this account about deaths connected to interactions with ICE, including named individuals. I'm going to handle that carefully. Any death in connection with government action is a serious matter that demands independent investigation, transparent reporting, and accountability where wrongdoing exists. But responsible commentary doesn't turn tragedy into theater or assert facts that haven't been established in court or through verified reporting. The point, even without litigating each allegation, is that the stakes of noncompliance and chaos are not abstract. When systems become unaccountable, people get hurt. And that's why the court orders matter. Court orders are not bureaucratic clutter. Court orders are guardrails designed to prevent human harm. If you want the most revealing political takeaway from this entire story, it's this. The Trump administration's enforcement machine appears to be so obsessed with speed and spectacle that it is losing the one battle it cannot afford to lose: legitimacy. Because legitimacy is what separates enforcement from intimidation. Legitimacy is what separates rule of law from rule by force. Legitimacy is what makes the public accept that power is being used fairly, predictably, and within constitutional limits. And what's being described here is the opposite. A government lawyer saying there is no guidance, a judge saying the crisis is self-inflicted by disobedience, a chief judge warning that contempt is coming because ICE keeps violating orders, and an entire federal office described as bleeding people because nobody wants to be part of a machine that treats the courts like a nuisance. That is not strength. That is decay. And Trump's favorite trick is to confuse those two things. He sells decay as toughness. He sells disobedience to law as leadership. He sells institutional collapse as draining the swamp. But when the U.S. Attorney's Office is depleted and the courts are issuing extraordinary warnings, you're not draining anything. You're breaking things that you don't know how to fix. And I want you to notice the irony that should be humiliating to any administration that claims to stand for law and order. The people actually defending law and order in this story are the judges, not the politicians, not the agencies, the judges. The courts are the ones saying, comply, follow the order, challenge it legally if you want, but follow it unless it's overturned. That's the basic rule. That's the rule that keeps us from becoming a country where power just does what it wants. So if you want a clean summary of the Trump era in one courtroom exchange, here it is. Trump's government is running so hot, so chaotic, and so contemptuous of limits that its own lawyers are breaking down in court. The judiciary is responding by escalating warnings, threatening contempt, and demanding the personal appearance of top officials. And the public is left watching this and realizing something that should never have to be learned the hard way. The Constitution doesn't enforce itself. People enforce it. Courts enforce it. Officials choose to comply with it or they don't. And right now, the question isn't whether Trump has a good slogan. The question is whether the executive branch will accept that it is not above the law. Because if it won't, then the courts have to make it. And if the courts can't, then we're not arguing about immigration policy anymore. We're arguing about what kind of country this is